Hello class, welcome to this week's lectures. We are going to start off going through schedules of reinforcement. So what are schedules of reinforcement? Basically, they just tell you how consequences are arranged and to what degree. So we've been talking about reinforcement, reinforcers or punishers. Schedules of reinforcement refer both to reinforcers and punishers. And we've talked about how if you engage in a particular behavior, reinforcer or punisher can be given that will then increase or decrease the future probability of behavior. However, we haven't specified how frequently, how often. Is it every time the behavior occurs? Is it some of the time the behavior occurs? Is it after every 3 times the behavior occurs, every 10 times? And all of these actually have important consequences and differences, and we'll talk about those in this lecture. So next, we'll talk about what must occur for reinforcement to be presented. So what are the specific contingencies? Does it need to happen every time, some of the time? How frequently, how infrequently? So the first breakdown or categories is what we call continuous reinforcement and intermittent reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement is essentially you get reinforced every time. Intermittent reinforcement means you get reinforced some of the time. So your typical vending machine or Coke machine is going to be your standard continuous schedule of reinforcement. This is every time you put in your money into the Coke machine, you push the buttons, you get a Coke. And intermittent reinforcement, every time you put your money into the slot machine, push the button on the slot machine, there's a very slim chance that you'll get any money back. So intermittent is some of the time, continuous is every time. As you can imagine, there's really only one type of continuous schedule, which is every single time. But with intermittent, there's a wide variety of ways that we could break this down. And we'll go through those today. So how are reinforcers delivered? There are 4 major schedule types. There's a fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. Fixed refers to whether it's always the same, and then variable would mean that it changes from round to round and it's not always the same. Ratio means that it depends on the number of times you have to engage in a behavior. So if a slot machine was programmed such that you had to put in money 1,000 times and then you would get money back, that would be a ratio. Interval means that it's based off of time, not the amount of behavior you engage in something. So if instead the slot machine would time out once every hour and a half or after a certain specific time and not necessarily off of a specific number of times the slot machine the button was pushed, then you would be looking at interval instead of ratio. So ratio are going to be reinforcers that occur after a certain number of responses. Interval is going to be reinforcers occur after the first response after a certain period of time. So in an interval schedule, it's important that there still needs to be a response to occur, right? With a slot machine, if it was interval-based, even if it was interval-based, it's not just going to go off randomly. You still need someone to put in the coin and push the button. But after its timer has sort of timed out, then the first time you put your money in and push the button, it will then deliver the reinforcer. Fixed means that the requirement for a reinforcer does not change from one reinforcer or one reinforcement event to the next, whereas invariable means that it does change from time to time. We can still describe it, and we typically describe it by its mean. So for example, if I had a variable ratio 10, it means that on average, it would require 10 responses if it was ratio to have a reinforcer delivered. But sometimes it could be 1, sometimes it could be 2, sometimes it could be 12, sometimes it could be 14. But all of those numbers over some defined period of time would average out to be about 10. So then you can create this matrix. You're probably getting sick of this because we did this with positive, negative reinforcement punishment, but we can do the same with fixed, variable, ratio, interval, such that we can have a variable ratio where the reinforcer is delivered after a variable number of responses, fixed ratio where the reinforcer is delivered after a fixed number of responses, variable interval where the reinforcer is delivered after the first response after an average amount of minutes or seconds, and then a reinforcer is delivered after the first response after a fixed period of time. So we have different sort of real world examples of what these would look like. So your slot machine is actually typically programmed off of a ratio schedule. It's a number of plays, not a period of time. So after a certain number of plays, that number can be variable and obviously quite thin. So your slot machine will be a variable ratio. A fixed ratio would be typically when individuals are paid on a per product or per production basis. So if you had to, if you got paid every 20 sort of garments sewed or something to that effect, that would be an example of a fixed ratio. Variable interval goes off of a period of time, and that can be variable. So an example would be if you keep your email sort of off and you check your email, it follows a variable interval schedule. So it's going to be varying different periods of time between whether you get an email or not into your email inbox. So it's variable, but it's also time-based. You could check your email 10,000 times or one time. It's not going to make a difference. The number of times you check it isn't going to make email come any faster, but you will get reinforced the first time you check it after an email has come, and the timings between emails follow a pretty random pattern, but they're time-based. And then a fixed interval example would be perhaps in situations in which you have a fixed amount of medicine you can self-administer. You can only administer it after a certain period of time, and after you administer it, you have to wait for that period of time to finish before you can administer again. So when it comes to numbers and how we set parameters, an FR30 would indicate that every 30th response is reinforced because it's fixed ratio. So FR fixed ratio 30, every 30 reinforcers or 30 responses are reinforced. FI30S means that fixed interval, so it's time-based. The S stands for seconds. So on average, every 30 seconds, sorry, not on average, fixed, every 30 seconds, the first response after 30 seconds is reinforced. With variable ratio and a variable ratio 30, its reinforcements after 30 responses on average are reinforced. So sometimes it could be 10, sometimes it could be 60, sometimes it could be 20. But overall, that number would average out to 30. And then a variable interval for 30 seconds means, again, it's time-based, so 30 seconds, but it's on average 30 seconds, but it can sometimes be 20 seconds, sometimes 40 seconds, sometimes 60 seconds, sometimes 10 seconds. But on average, it would average out to about 30 seconds. So we have continuous schedules. The only continuous schedule that is available is a fixed ratio 1, which means that every response produces a reinforcer. Or you can have intermittent, where then you can have ratio or interval, and they can be fixed or variable, producing 4 different types of schedules, fixed ratio being one example, but these would all be intermittent schedules, as long as it's not fixed ratio 1. So largely the importance of schedules lies mainly in their ability to produce orderly and predictable behavior. So the reason why we talk about these different types of schedules is that they produce very different patterns of behavior based off of whether you are reinforcing off of one of these schedules or not. Importantly, these are about steady state behavior, meaning that this is after the animal has learned about the consequences of the reinforcement schedule. It's not like the first time you put an animal on a VI 30 seconds, you're going to expect a particular pattern. There's going to be a period of learning followed by reaching a steady state pattern which will be the typical pattern sort of thereafter. So how do we look at these kinds of things? We'll be looking at what we call cumulative records, which is how we look at changes or the different types of behavior patterns among the different reinforcement schedules. This is an example of an old cumulative record. They're obviously not done this way, but back in the 50s, this is how they were done. And it was quite common to see pictures of these types of cumulative record graphs. So a paper roll is basically scrolling at a set period of time or a set frequency so that the paper is only flowing along a certain period of time. Every time the animal makes a response, you see a little uptick in the pen. So it keeps going up, 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 up. So the faster it goes up, the more responses are being made in that unit time because the paper is flowing at a very controlled and specific period of time. So then if you get a graph that goes up really, really fast, then that means that there's a lot of responses per unit time. If you get a pattern that is kind of very slow, then it would indicate that there are few responses per period of time. This also allows you to look at things like bursts in period of time or any other kinds of behavioral patterns for that matter. The other pens, the marking pen, so the blue pen here is indicating when reinforcers are being delivered. So every time you see one of these marks, it means that a reinforcer was delivered. And it produces ultimately a cumulative record or a real-time sort of continuous record of the state of responding. This is what I was talking about between a slow and a fast rate. Get my handy pen. So this period of time is a slow rate because over this unit of time, this period of time on our x-axis is a long period of time and we make very few responses, whereas from say here to here is a much shorter period of time, but we make a lot more responses in that period of time. So this is a fast rate, this is a slow rate, and allows you to rapidly see how quickly responding was at different times within an experiment. Excuse me, sorry. So fixed ratios are quite, cumulative records are quite frequently used to be able to observe all of these different kinds of responses. And we'll be talking about how each type of reinforcement schedule produces a unique and specific type of cumulative record response. I'm going to let you guys take a break here and we'll pick you back up onto the next slide once you're ready.